Alright, so now we're going to start into part 2 of our lecture for chapter 11. That's Intro to PSTs or Psychological Skill Training. So something we should consider is kind of how PSTs might go beyond sport. And this is just one slide on this. It's pretty short. But the thinking here is it's not just that PSTs can be used for athletes in sport or with sports psychologists. We might think of a PE instructor, right? So they're doing more physical activity-based work, but they might do something like relaxation therapy or training to teach a hyperactive kid to calm down. Also, a physical therapist or an AT might use goal-setting techniques to try and maintain the motivation for an individual with some sort of serious problem, injury, something like that. But then we can also think of maybe a fitness instructor. They might use things like positive self-statements, so not self-talk where it's that internal monologue, but now they're just kind of projecting a lot of positive statements to enhance the self-esteem of the people that they work with. So again, these skills, while they are really important and the training that goes into it can be utilized by sports psych consultants, it can also be used by a lot of people in different professions. Now there is one ultimate goal to all PSTs, and that's really self-regulation. The book goes over this a good bit, so definitely earmark that. Think about how PSTs in their relation to self-regulation. So after, as it says here, after PST training, an athlete should be able to monitor or self-regulate his or her own emotional state. So that's really at the core of what self-regulation is. So these PSTs really allow you to become a lot more self-aware. So self-regulation is the ability to work towards one's short and long-term goals by effectively monitoring and managing one's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And you can see how these, especially being able to monitor and manage your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors as an athlete is going to be extremely important in achieving your, whether they be short or long-term goals. So now let's talk about implementing PST programs. So who should conduct these? Excuse me. Should it just be sports psychologists? Should it be a coach? Well, actually, it could be both. Okay, so both can do this as long as they recognize their limits. This can be kind of a tricky dance, if you will, because for a coach, they don't want, they need to be in a position of authority. They need to provide structure for the sport experience. They don't want to be showing complete favoritism towards one athlete. So implementing psychological skills or working on those with individual athletes might be misconveyed in some way. But at the same time, maybe you're working on a team or you're coaching a team that doesn't have the budget to bring in a sports psychologist. This happens. So there's kind of some elements here that make it tricky. But also a coach needs to recognize maybe their conflict of interest here too, because sometimes the coach has alternative motives, right? So a lot of times coaches, if we're talking about collegiate athletics, they're often in this profession because they like to win. The ultimate goal is to win some title or something like that. It's also to develop student athletes, but ultimately a lot of their job often requires winning. And because of that, a coach who's trying to implement PSTs might be more selective about which PSTs they decide to pick and which ones they're going to emphasize in their own programming. The next question, though, is, well, okay, so we kind of have an idea of who should be doing this, but when should they be doing this? When should we implement a program to actually tackle some of these skills? And ideally, this is going to happen in the off season. Like I mentioned earlier in part 1, you really need a lot of time to come up with a program, figure out what the team needs, come up with the program, begin to implement and tailor your PSTs, and then practice them and try to implement them. And that takes a great deal of time. And this isn't always something that's going to work in the here and now. It's not something that can be a quick fix. So how long should training last? Well, often we usually say maybe 10-15 minutes a day, maybe 3 to 5 times a week. And that can be different if you're working with a team or if you're working with an individual. If you're working with an individual, these are pretty good guidelines. If it's going to be a team, it usually has to be a bit of a longer session, but then you might not meet with them as often throughout the week. So the last question here is important. So if we're talking about athletes or people engaged in physical activity, when's the best time to get them on board with PSTs, with psychological skill training? Well, to be honest, ideally we're going to do this across their whole career. Now that's not going to happen in most cases. Often sports psychologists are brought in at a point. At a later point in someone's athletic career, when something's not going right, or if they're really trying to push to get to the next level. And when that occurs, then it's good to make them aware and educate them of what PSTs are, work with them, but then ultimately, hopefully they're going to carry that out going forward on their own, and not need that one-on-one training. So how do we go about designing a PST program? Well, what you need to do is really try to follow these 5 steps. So we're going to go over each one of these. Discuss your approach, assess the athlete's mental skills, determine which psychological skills to include, determine a PST schedule, and evaluate the program. So let's break this down. So discussing your approach. Really what needs to happen in the beginning is you need to identify the services that a sports psychologist can provide. You don't want to go into this being a used car salesman selling a team or coach an athlete on all these great things when really maybe you don't have the ability to teach all those skills. You need to explain the differences between an educational and a clinical sports psychology consultant. And remember, educational is more the ones who are geared at this PST programming, whereas clinical sports psychologists are going to work with individuals with potential emotional disorders. You'll want to discuss your approach, again, with the team, athlete, parents, whoever's involved. But ultimately, you really need to build up some rapport or some trust with the client. So whether that's the coach, team, athlete, whatever it might be, again, that's going to be really important because to some degree, as a sports psychologist, you need to have some freedom. You need to have some assurances that you'll be honest, and so will the athlete in their interactions, and they're going to be committed to the process, and so forth. The next component, assessing mental skills. So clearly you need to know where you're at before you can figure out where you need to go. So we need to assess the strengths and weaknesses of mental skills for our client. Okay, so we can do this in objective ways or subjective. So objective ways, kind of removing any bias that the individual might have. So we can think of maybe giving surveys, kind of as it says in the next bullet, but using surveys, interviews, inventories, that kind of stuff. But that's going to allow us to kind of pinpoint where they're at with certain skills. Do they excel at self-talk, but their imagery skills are fairly low? Those kind of things. You need to know that before you can really implement a program or design a program. Also, as a sports psych consultant, you need to consider the unique demands of sport. That's going to be really important because if you come in thinking that, oh, I'm going to work with the diving team, we're going to focus on imagery that really helps, we'll implement a relaxation script and walk them through that. It's going to be great. Well, speaking from my own experience, I once worked with a diver and kind of thought, hey, why don't we try imagery? That might help you relax or become more familiar with the process. And the athlete looked at me and said, imagery, you want me to imagine diving? And I said, well, we'll get to that. But yeah, and the guy looked at me and he goes, "I can already tell you what that is. That's ceiling, pool, ceiling, pool, ceiling, pool," and then I hit the water. And I didn't really consider that. I didn't think of the fact that, oh, imagery in this sport is a person spinning and twisting in the air. Now, there's ways to work around that or to address that, but I definitely wasn't prepared for that. I didn't think about the demands of this sport. Also, thinking of the demands of sport, think of something like football. Usually there's a great deal of weightlifting. Heck, there's nutrition guidelines that they've got. So what did I say? Weightlifting, nutrition, practices, tape, video hours. They've got team meetings. They've got training with the athletic trainers, so on and so forth. So being aware of the mental load that the person's under. And then also it's important to actually talk to other people. Now, maybe not explicitly say, oh, I'm working with this person. Can you tell me about them? But start to get a feel from the coaches, maybe the trainers, come in and say, hey, I've been contacted by an athlete. We're going to work on motivation, or we're going to work on positive self-talk. Can you kind of give me a feel for the team, for the dynamics that are going on? How do they interact? Those kind of things. Because that's going to be important in how you tailor your program and know where they're at, maybe with their work ethic and those kind of things. Another element that you should consider is which skills to include, and that kind of goes back to the demands of the sport or activity personally, I think, because it needs to be some kind of relevant skill. But there needs to be a distinction made between skills and methods. Skills are qualities to be obtained. So we can think of things like self-awareness, confidence. I want to, build up my confidence. Methods are how we get to that. So methods are the producers. They're the techniques. So we can think of arousal regulation, imagery, goal setting, those kind of things. The next step is you need to determine some type of schedule. So again, you'll want to hold frequent, shorter meetings rather than infrequent, longer meetings. You'll probably get more consistency out of the athletes this way because you're able to touch base with them a little bit more and see what things are working, what things aren't working, and then tweak the program as need be. You can also hold informal meetings as well as formal meetings. So you could have team meetings that are very formal, scheduled, and then you could have informal meetings where maybe you bump into an athlete on campus, or you give them a call, or you just text them if they're comfortable with that, and just kind of check in, see how the stuff they've been working on is going. Is it working? Are they having some problems with it? As I mentioned before, though, whenever possible, you want to start psychological skill training before a season starts because you want to be able to practice something before you put it into motion when there's a competition or a competitive season going on. And then lastly, you should definitely have some kind of systematic schedule, so something planned out for your psychological skill training to try and implement it into the day. So that way they're getting daily practice. It's just like learning how to shoot a puck, to kick a ball, anything like that. You've got to practice it daily to become better at it. Also, there's the idea of periodization. This refers to any plan variation in training variables. So you can kind of think of tweaking the volume intensity of training cycles, those kind of things. This is important as well for PSTs because we have systematic periodization. So you can kind of see we might mentally tax someone earlier on if they're in the preparatory phase, but once they're in competition, it's about stabilizing and staying at a high level or high intensity and keeping them aware of their practice and their performance. And that way we can really work towards this peaking phase where the athlete is peaking at the right time in the season. Now there's more on that in the textbook. Definitely check this out. So I believe it's page 264. Check out the special boxes. You guys should be checking those out anyway. That stuff's all fair game as a heads up for later on. in the exams and even the little activities at the end of the chapters. So definitely read those boxes. There's usually some pretty good info in those yellow boxes in the textbook. The last step that you'll want to do is you need to evaluate the program. It's one thing to go ahead, design something, implement it, but if you don't go back and evaluate and see if it worked, if it didn't work, why it did or didn't work, then it's kind of meaningless. You're just kind of hoping or assuming things are happening. So why not systematically or actually critically go in and evaluate your program? So you don't want to overlook this. A lot of times trainers have some ethical obligation to evaluate their program's effectiveness. It doesn't always get done. But this is something that they should be doing at all times, because we don't want to, if by some freak accident we're harming someone's performance. That's the last thing we want to do. Now we can evaluate the program that we've designed. We can do this with interviews. We can do some written assessments, so kind of ask for a survey. We can even start to look at performance measures, and a great example of this is in baseball. So if you have, baseball is a great one for performance measures in that we have tons of stats, ridiculous amount of stats on baseball players. We have them for other sports, but just not to the same detail usually that there is in baseball. And we can actually look at historically how athletes or teams have done, and then we can also compare that with how they've done now with this PST program. So of course something we've talked about or mentioned in the first part of the videos is this idea of being effective. Well, what about being an effective consultant? And there's been a good amount of research that's looked at this. There have been interviews, trying to figure out what athletes want. And the common things that come up is the consultant should be accessible. It's someone who they get along well with. They build rapport early on. The individual's flexible. They're knowledgeable enough to meet the needs of the individual athlete, but they don't speak in jargon. So they're not going to talk about, oh, we're going to work on your self-regulation and da-da-da. They're going to talk about, hey, I'm going to help you become more self-aware, or I'm going to help you become more aware of how you react in a competitive arena. Because sometimes athletes, they don't always want to hear all the research. They want to know, how does this work? What is this thing I'm dealing with? And that's what a good consultant kind of excels at, is taking the science and really making it manageable, or kind of doing the translation there for athletes. Often you want to have someone who's likable. They have something concrete to offer, so it's not something like they're just shooting from the hip, but they actually have some idea of the program they want to implement. So usually these individuals as well aren't just going to leave their team or athlete hanging. They're going to follow up with them, and they're going to figure out if things are working, if things need to be changed, how can we change them, those kind of things. And they'll do that after the season as well. So that way it's not just this, oh, you're going to come in, I'll work with you a couple times in the beginning of the season while you're training, and then good luck with your season. So hopefully a consultant can check in every so often. The last element here, though, is that the consultant needs to be trustworthy, and they need to be able to fit into the team. Trustworthy is going to be huge, because sometimes a consultant's going to hear things that athletes don't want coaches to know, and sometimes you're going to hear things that coaches say that athletes probably don't need to hear. So it's really it's an interesting dance again, where you're trying to cater to the athlete's performance if you're working with them one-on-one, but also not jumping on the bandwagon and saying, oh yeah, your coach is crazy. So there needs to be some rapport built where you have honest conversations and interactions with the team, coaches, individuals, but also where you as a consultant can be honest to them. The last element here are some common problems. These which is interesting, a couple of them link back to those myths that we talked about in the first part of the lecture. So lack of conviction. A lot of times athletes, coaches, that kind of thing, they look at PST training is something to come in and do, and then magically things are going to happen. But again, as I've been lecturing about this, it's all about commitment. It's all about doing this daily and really trying to take hold of the program. Lack of time, a lot of people will say that. A lot of people aren't willing, even consultants aren't willing to put in the time, and that gets to be difficult. So again, you need to be able to find time, schedule it out, and do the steps to make the PSTs really work for the athlete. Sometimes coaches and athletes feel that an individual doesn't know the sport, and I can speak a little bit from experience here. I'm a former soccer player, and I actually worked with a baseball team, a college baseball team once. I know next to nothing about baseball. But what I did is I sought out another sports psych student at the time who did play baseball and would just ask them questions. You know, they were dumb questions, but I made it clear to him, hey, I've got a lot of dumb questions, and I just need to know so that way when I walk into a room with 35 plus college guys playing baseball, I actually can recognize what's going on. And that really helped. Because otherwise, athletes aren't going to buy in. If you know nothing about the sport, then why are they going to trust what you have to say? And the last one here is the lack of follow-up, and that one, again, is not only the evaluation of the program you've put in, but checking in with the athletes that you've been working with. You want to make sure that they're progressing, and if not, how can you be a resource for them? Alright, gang, I believe that's the end of this lecture. Make sure to look within this folder. Excuse me, there will be a link to, should be another activity, another 4-point activity. Try and get that done quickly. I don't remember offhand when the deadline is, but definitely look for that in the course materials here within the folder for Chapter 11. Alright, thanks guys.